My family is cursed. A clown shows up at everyone's 10th birthday, but no one ever hires one. My earliest memory of the clown is from my cousin Jake's 10th birthday party. I was only 5, but I distinctly remember the commotion surrounding the clown. I remember my parents preparing me before we left the house and on the drive there. "There's going to be a clown at Jake's party." My dad said, "Just be nice. All you have to do is be nice." My mom added. I didn't understand why they were so worried, why my mom kept wiping her hands on her dress the entire drive to Jake's house, or why my dad kept taking deep breaths. Weren't clowns supposed to be at birthday parties? When we got to Jake's house, there was something going on. The kids were running around the backyard and jumping in the bouncy castle, but the adults were standing around in silence, their eyes darting back and forth across the yard, while some of my aunts and uncles walked in and out of the house periodically. It was like they were all waiting for something to happen. As I jumped in the bouncy castle along with the rest of my cousins, I noticed a movement in the bushes near the gate that led into the backyard. I continued to bounce, trying to get higher each time in order to get a better look at whatever was there. Finally, I saw the clown appear from behind the bushes and watched as he unlatched the gate. I stopped bouncing and tried to maintain my balance as I watched the clown step into the yard and close the gate behind himself. I pushed my fingers through the mesh in the bouncy castle and pressed my face against it, staring at the clown as he scanned the backyard until his eyes landed on me. He stared at me for a few seconds, and I stared back, not really knowing what to do. Nobody else seemed to have noticed him yet, and my cousins continued bouncing around behind me. He was short, and he wore a curly, rainbow-colored wig. His face was white, and it seemed like his skin was naturally that pale. It didn't look like paint at all. His lips were normal size, but bright red, and he had a giant, round red nose. His eyes were dark, so dark that I couldn't distinguish the pupil from the iris. He had 2 black lines that started above his black eyebrows and ran down his eyelids to the tops of his cheeks, which appeared to be inflated with something. They were round and protruding, with a pink blush on them. His skin was smooth like porcelain. He wore yellow polka dot pants that were held up by red suspenders, and a white shirt with giant red buttons down the front, and red ruffles around the neck, chest, and sleeves. He wore shiny red clown shoes, and he carried a gift bag in one hand. I don't know how long I stood there watching him, but suddenly I was being pulled out of the bouncy house by my mom. She dragged me to a table and sat me down in a chair in between herself and my dad. I continued to watch the clown as he approached my cousin Lisa and pulled out a pink balloon from a pocket in his pants. He blew up the balloon and then twisted it into a dog, handing it to her. She took the balloon dog from the clown and ran to her mom, my Aunt Chelsea, who grabbed Lisa roughly and dragged her away from the clown. There was an impalpable amount of tension for the remainder of Jake's birthday party. Our parents wouldn't let us stray too far away, and the clown stayed the entire time, wandering around the yard and handing out balloon animals or honking his nose for the children. When it came time to open presents, we watched as Jake unwrapped countless video games and action figures, along with a few clothing items. Once he finished opening the last gift from a family member, the clown walked up to Jake and handed him the gift bag he had been carrying around for the entire party. I watched as Jake's mom tried to stop the clown from handing Jake the gift, while my uncle held her back. We all watched as Jake thanked the clown and opened the gift bag, taking out handfuls of tissue paper until he reached in and pulled out the gift. "It's a book," Jake said. I saw his mom sigh in relief, and Jake turned the book over in his hands, looking at it. It was a small, hardcover book with a glossy dust jacket that had a drawing of a beach on it. Jake thanked the clown, and it walked away from him, through the gate, and away from the house. Once he was gone, Jake's dad snatched the book from him. I asked him about it later, but he told me his parents had thrown it out. I saw the clown a few times after that. At every cousin's 10th birthday party, he would show up in the same outfit every time, and give them a hardcover picture book that their parents would get rid of. When I was 10, the same thing happened, and although I begged my parents to let me see the book, they declined. The night of my birthday party, I snuck out of my room and saw my dad go up into the attic with my book. I tried to find it a few times after that day, but he had hidden it well, and it was nowhere to be seen. I once asked my parents why any of us even had birthday parties if they were so afraid of the clown, but they told me that the clown would show up anyway. He always knew. I didn't see the clown for a couple of years. All of my cousins had passed the age of 10, and none of them were old enough to have their own children yet. When I turned 20, my parents died in a car accident and I inherited their house. By that time, I had forgotten all about the clown and the book and didn't care to read it or figure out why they had taken it away. And then about 12 years later, my daughter Wendy had her 10th birthday party. My wife knew about the clown, and we had already seen it appear once before at Jake's twins' birthday party. We had prepared Wendy and had given her the same warnings my parents had given me. Be nice to the clown. About 30 minutes into the party, the clown jumped over the backyard fence and wandered over to the table where Wendy and her cousins were getting makeovers. I stopped myself from running over and stopping him. He looked exactly as I had remembered him. Not a single thing had changed, not even his outfit. I watched as he caught my niece Alice's eye and pulled out a blue balloon from his pocket. He blew the balloon up and then pulled out another blue one and then used them both to form a hat, which he gently placed on her head. I watched as she thanked him, and he clapped his hands together and then continued to walk around my backyard. Nobody ever tried to stop him, because we had always been warned not to. We were never specifically told what would happen if we tried, but we knew it was bad, and none of us wanted to find out what it would be. When it was time to open presents, I continued to eye the gift bag in the clown's hand. Once Wendy was done with opening the gifts given to her by family members, the clown approached her and handed her the bag. She took it gently and slowly opened it, digging around the tissue paper until she pulled out the book. "Thank you," she said, smiling at the clown. He took a bow and then walked away, jumping back over the fence. I let out a sigh of relief once he was gone, and I approached Wendy, taking the book from her. She didn't seem to mind that it was being taken. She seemed glad. I decided to hide it up in the attic, just as my parents had done with mine, but as I stared at it in my hands, curiosity was beginning to set it. It was the same as all the other books I had seen, hardcover with a glossy dust jacket that contained a drawing on the front but no title. This one had a drawing of a girl that resembled Wendy, standing in front of a birthday cake and about to blow out the candles. She had the same curly brown hair and green eyes as Wendy. I opened the book and noticed an inscription on the inside of the cover that said, "Happy 10th, Wendy." The first page was blank, but the next page was where the story started. There was a drawing of the girl on the cover, wearing a party hat and holding a pile of gifts. Under that it read, "Today is Wendy's 10th. How happy is she? She got every gift she wants, even things she doesn't need." I turned the page as I continued to read the story that depicted various drawings of a girl that resembled my daughter, as she did various birthday party activities. Wendy laughs along with friends, and all her guests are filled with glee. Wendy tries to sneak a peek at every gift that she receives, was inscribed at the bottom of the page. There were drawings of Wendy with family and friends, everyone smiling and hugging Wendy. And then, from beyond the backyard fence, comes the best guest of them all. A funny clown, here to have a ball, was carved into the page. On that page was a drawing of the clown as it jumped over the fence, grinning. This clown loves to party, and it loves 10th birthdays too. He will never miss a chance to show up where he's due. The engraved words read. The next drawing was of the clown in the center of the page, surrounded by black aura, but this birthday is a bit different. Something big is going to happen. The clown is so excited, this doesn't happen often, was scribbled at the bottom of the page. I turned the page to see a drawing of the clown, running around the party chasing the guests who appeared to be frightened. They'd been drawn with their mouths open and wide-eyed as they ran away from the clown. The clown runs around the yard and pulls something from his pocket. Not a balloon, not a magic handkerchief, but something big and sharp and shiny, it read. The next page had a drawing of a gleaming butcher knife, dripping with blood. "A lot of guests must die, but don't worry, Wendy will be fine," it continued. The next 4 pages contained various drawings of the clown slaughtering people at the birthday party. Some had their necks sliced open, some were stabbed, and some lost body parts. "The clown has had his fun, his job here has been done. Happy 10th birthday to Wendy. He will see you at the next one." The final engraving said. The last drawing was of the clown jumping back over the fence, leaving a pile of dead bodies behind him. I shut the book as a chill ran down my spine. I realized why our parents never showed us the books, especially if they were all this creepy, and I wondered why the clown would even give us these books. I decided to do as my parents had done and get rid of the book at the end of the party. As I tossed the book on top of the fridge, I heard the first scream. I ran to the door and threw it open, just in time to see everyone running away from the clown. He was back, and he stood right by the fence with a butcher knife in his hands. On the ground next to him was my cousin Paula's child, Trevor, face down in the grass. I scanned the backyard, looking for Wendy, but she was nowhere to be seen. All the guests ran across the yard, trying to get as far away from the clown as possible. I watched as Jake tossed his children over the fence and into the neighbor's yard, followed by his husband and then himself. I looked for my wife, and I spotted her running towards me and into the house. "Where's Wendy?" I asked her, grabbing her arm. "She jumped the fence a while ago. She's fine. We need to hide." She dragged me inside with her as the screams continued. A few more family members made it inside, and we hid in the kitchen and the living room. After a while, the screams died out, and I slowly got up, opening the door and peering out into the backyard. "He's gone," I said as I threw open the door and walked outside. There were a total of 10 dead people, and a few minutes after the cops arrived, so did Jake, his family, and Wendy. I ran to her as I saw her coming up the driveway, picking her up into my arms. "I'm so glad you're okay," I said. I kept her by my side for the rest of the night as we answered questions. I didn't tell the police that I knew the clown, as they would never believe my story about the curse. Instead, we all told them that we had no idea who the clown was and that we hadn't hired anyone. Hours later, everyone was finally gone. Wendy had gone to bed, and I went downstairs and helped my wife clean up some of the mess. Once we were done, I grabbed the book from on top of the fridge and handed it to her. "What's this?" she asked. "It's what he gave her, Rose," I said as she opened it. "Read it." I waited for her to finish reading the book. Once she was done, she tossed it onto the counter. "What the fuck?" she hissed. "Did he plan all that? Is this supposed to be some stupid joke?" I shrugged. "Did this happen to everyone else?" she asked. "I don't know. Our parents never let us see the books," I replied. "This is so fucked up, David." We stood in silence as Rose grabbed the book again, giving it a disgusted look. "I'm gonna go look for something," I said suddenly. I made my way to the attic entrance in the hall and pulled down the ladder. I slowly made my way up, each step creaking as I stood on it. When I reached the top, I flipped the switch and the lights turned on, illuminating the attic enough for me to see. I dug through countless boxes and moved old decor and furniture around until I found it. The book that had been given to me on my 10th birthday. It had been hidden under the cushion of an old chair. I pulled it out and looked at the drawing of a house with a single light on in one of the windows. I opened the book and found a similar engraving on the inside cover that read, "Happy 10th, David." I turned the pages and began to read the story, ignoring the pictures. "Today is David's 10th birthday. What a good one it will be." The first engraving said, "David eats pizza. His favorite topping is cheese. He has a water balloon fight with cousin Eric, and they take cover in the trees." The next line said, "Everything is fun, and soon it will be great. Here comes the clown. He is never ever late." It continued. "David's birthday was a blast, and his gifts were all so fun. But don't be sad that it's over. The fun has just begun." Years go by, and the clown sees Dave again. "It's now his daughter's 10th birthday, and today the fun will end," was written on the next page. A lot of guests had fun, and for others this day was their last. But David's family is alive. Thank the clown for that. And now it's time for bed. Time to get some sleep. Don't forget to check on Wendy. She hasn't made a peep, was engraved on the last page. The final drawing in the book showed an empty bed in a dark room with a window that was wide open. I stared at it for a second before it hit me. I tossed the book aside as I got a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something was wrong. "Wendy," I shouted. "What's going on?" Rose called. I didn't reply as I hurried down the ladder and ran down the hall into Wendy's bedroom, throwing the door open. I flipped the light on and looked around the room, but I was too late. She was gone. Her bed was empty, and her window was wide open. My name is Ava, and yesterday was my 8th birthday. Last night when my dad came home from work, he brought me a big chocolate cake with vanilla frosting that had my name on it, and I got to blow out the candles. I didn't even have to eat dinner first. It was the best day, even though I didn't have a party. It doesn't matter though, because I've never had a party before. My mom and dad say that I'm not allowed because we can't have any other people in the house. They lie and tell me that it's because we live too far away, but I know that it is because of my friend Evie who lives with us. Evie looks exactly like me and we are like sisters. She is not really my sister though, we just say that. Evie can do this really cool trick where she can move my arms and say things in my voice. Sometimes it is a little bit annoying, but she's my friend, so it's okay. My mom and dad don't like Evie though, and this makes her very mad. My mom says that Evie needs help and we have to see someone for her. I don't know what she means, but Evie says that my mom is a liar and I don't like telling Evie that she is wrong. My dad gets really mad and yells at Evie to stop and to shut up and leave me alone, but that just makes her more mad. I've tried to tell him to stop, but he doesn't listen. Yesterday when my dad brought home the cake, he asked me if I liked it, and I told him yes, and that Evie liked it too. He got really mad, but my mom told him that it was not the time, and he didn't say anything about her. When they lit the candles and told me to make a wish, I didn't know what to wish for. I kind of wanted some new paints so that I could make more paintings for my room, but I also wanted a puppy or some new toys. Mostly I wanted to wish for Evie to stay, but Evie thought that was a stupid wish because she says she's always going to be with me forever, so I didn't wish for that. I asked Evie what else I should wish for, and my dad got really mad and told me to just make a wish already, because this was none of Evie's business. That made me a little bit sad because it was Evie's business, and she was with us, and that was rude of him to yell at her like that. My mom said it was okay, but Dad said that it was not normal. Evie was also getting mad because Dad said she wasn't normal. Everyone was just mad, and I almost cried, but then Evie told me to just make my wish because she would make any of my wishes come true. I thought about it really hard, but then Mom told me to hurry up or else the cake was going to get ruined. So I finally decided to wish for my parents to leave Evie alone and be nice to her. Then I blew out the candles and my mom clapped, but I could tell that my dad was still mad. We ate cake anyway, but I didn't ask if Evie could have some because it was finally a good time. We finished the entire cake all by ourselves, and I was even allowed to have 2 whole pieces. It was awesome. Last night, I had a really scary nightmare that I stabbed my mom and my dad in their bed when they were asleep. It was really scary, and I woke up and cried, but I don't think they heard me because no one came to check on me. Only Evie was there, and she said it was okay. When it was morning, I got up, but my mom didn't make any breakfast, and she didn't answer when I was yelling for her. Evie says that they are still asleep and that I shouldn't go up to their room, so I didn't. Evie helped me to make breakfast. She showed me how to make a burrito with eggs and some chicken that she bought. It was really messy because Evie said that it was fresh meat that had just been killed. I already know that they kill animals for food because my grandpa has a farm, and I had seen them make a turkey before, so I knew that it was very messy. After I ate, Evie said that we could watch TV. She said that I didn't even have to clean up because Mom and Dad weren't going to even see it. She told me that she made my wish come true and that they weren't going to be mad at us anymore, and they weren't going to yell at us either. Evie says that now we can do whatever we want. I had ice cream and I watched cartoons all morning instead of going to school. And when the phone rang and the school called, Evie talked to them, and she sounded just like my mom. She told them that I was sick, and the lady believed her. It was so fun, and I didn't even know that she could do that. Evie let me use my mom's laptop because she says she knows the password. She told me I could write on here like a diary and post it so other people could read it. Isn't that so cool? I wonder who is reading this. Evie just made me lunch, and it was a sandwich with meat again. I don't eat this much meat because my mom likes for me to eat my veggies, but Evie says that mom is not the boss anymore, so I can eat whatever I want. I had a lot of chips, and my tummy started to hurt, and I really wanted my mom, but Evie said that it was okay and she could make it feel better. Evie told me to take a nap, and so I did, but I had another scary dream that I was cutting up mom and dad because Evie was making me. When I woke up, Evie said it was just a dream because mom and dad were still asleep upstairs. I want to go and see them, but Evie says I can't, or else it will ruin the wish, and we will get in big trouble for making a mess and eating junk. I think I'm gonna go play hide and seek with Evie now. When I was a kid, my dad kept a second family in our basement. Growing up, I thought everyone had a second family in their basement. In retrospect, I understand how ridiculous that sounds, but it was all I'd ever known. I knew that every night, my dad tented the leftovers from dinner with foil, got up without a word, and carried the plate to the basement. I'd listen from my room as he lumbered down the creaking steps, held my breath to hear the muffled mumblings of his greeting. I knew that every morning, he'd make the trip downstairs to see his second family off before work, then kiss me on the top of my head and ruffle my hair as he walked out. I knew that each Christmas, he'd bring a sack of brightly wrapped packages downstairs in a Santa suit. I knew that my dad had a second family in the basement, and it seemed so normal that I thought everyone else did too. I'll never forget the first time I asked my mom about them. I was young, maybe 5, when I finally found the words to ask, "Mommy, why can't I play with the people in the basement?" My mom was the human embodiment of frenetic energy, an organic perpetual motion machine, always pacing, or cleaning, or stirring a pot, always with a lit cigarette tucked between her yellowing fingers. I'll never forget that, as that question hung in the air, she finally stopped for the first time. Her stillness was unsettling in a way I can't quite explain. "We don't talk about them," she rushed, chasing the hurried statement with a lengthy drag off her cigarette. She blew a plume of smoke out the opened window before leaning down to meet me at face level, her bloodshot eyes mere inches from my own. "You don't need to play with the kids, but the kids need Daddy." She paused again, the haunting image of her at a standstill etching itself into my mind permanently. Finally, she muttered, "Daddy needs them too." That night, I heard my mom shrieking at my dad in their bedroom. I was surprised that they didn't know that I knew, more shocked, frightened even, to find that they didn't want me to know. Most of all, they didn't want me to tell anyone at school, anyone at all, really. After that night, everything was different. My dad only tented the leftovers after dinner, only brought the food downstairs after I'd gone to bed. He stopped visiting them in the mornings altogether. My mom started acting differently too. I'd always noticed that she was distant from my dad, had always noticed how she bristled under his touch, how she stole away to the other side of the room whenever he entered. But it got worse after that. As a kid, I felt deeply guilty. I felt like I'd ruined my parents' marriage. But I was just a kid, and I was curious. My mom meant to dissuade me from asking more questions, but she accidentally gave away something that made me even more curious. The downstairs family had kids, maybe kids my own age to play with. I needed to know about them, in the way that little kids need to understand all of the strangeness of this chaotic world, need to make sense of the nonsense that surrounds us daily. The nonsense that we become acclimated to as adults, but struggle with endlessly as children, like a puzzle or a riddle or a word problem on a math test about buying 80 watermelons. Another change following that critical night, the basement door was fitted with sturdy lock. Even still, I needed to know. There's something horribly dreadful about finding out that a second basement family is abnormal, something more horrible still about not knowing who or why. By the time I was 7, I made up my mind to get to the bottom of it. To avoid getting in trouble, I could only investigate when three conditions were met. I was home from school, my dad was still at work, and my mom wasn't around to catch me. These circumstances rarely overlapped, but the first time I came home from school to find that my dad's car wasn't in the garage, and my mom's endless movement had driven her to the point of exhaustion, I threw off my shoes and crept to the basement door, quiet in my sock feet. And then, I knocked. It was a quiet knock for fear of waking my mom from her nap, but it was a knock nonetheless. It was more than just a knock, too. It was an initiation, an invitation, a confrontation of my life's greatest and most terrifying mystery. I jumped when a gentle knock returned from the other side. It was almost immediate, like the person on the other side had been waiting for me. The thought froze me in place for a moment, but I knew I didn't have time to waste. My mouth felt suddenly of sandpaper and chalk, but I leaned into the door to whisper, "Hi." "Hi," a voice said. It was a little girl, her voice sweet yet timid, like testing the keys on a piano for the first time. "I'm Ricky. What's your name?" A long pause. "Leela. My brother's is Isaac, but he doesn't talk so good. But he's still little. Mommy says he'll start talking when he's ready." "There's three of you down there?" She replied simply, as if the entire situation felt as wholly normal for her as it had for me on the opposite side of the basement door. "Daddy comes to visit sometimes, though, so I guess there's four," she added. My eyes widened as a flurry of questions began to sprout in my mind, but I heard my mom start to stir in her room. I sped down the hallway and into the playroom. I busied my hands with my toys, but my mind was somewhere else. The sprouts of questions continued to grow rapidly, soon overtaking my thoughts like an unruly patch of weeds. And like weeds, the questions were stubborn, impossible to get rid of. The roots of the situation and its implication unraveled, stretched through my whole body. Fear planted itself firmly in my belly as I was forced to confront the possibility that I didn't really know my dad, didn't really know my own family at all. If my dad was Lila's dad too, what did that mean for me, for my family? And why wasn't she allowed to come out of the basement? Over the next couple years, I stole away to the basement door in those rare moments of freedom. I got to know Lila, got to like her, and eventually even to love her. She was my best friend. As a kid, I was pretty lonely. My classmates shied away from me for reasons I couldn't quite understand, like something about me was inherently repellent to my peers. I only had one friend at school, and at home I had Lila. As we spoke more, a never-ending stream of back-and-forth questioning crammed into the briefest moments of time, we both came to understand the differences between us, between our lives and our circumstances. The differences that at first felt so normal grew bigger and sharper and scarier than either of us could comprehend. The unfairness of it all became impossible to ignore. Lila lamented that she wasn't allowed to go to school, that she couldn't go outside to play or make friends or ride bikes around the cul-de-sac in the summer until the street lamps flickered on and the cicadas started to scream. She even longed for the things I loathed most: homework, rinsing off my dishes after dinner, tidying up my room each Sunday morning. She said she'd lived in that basement all of her life, was probably even born down there. She couldn't remember anything different before being locked up in the cold and musty room. I'm ashamed to admit this, but eventually, I couldn't manage the guilt I felt for living the life Lila never had, could never have in my mind. I was so young, so naive. I didn't know how to manage the situation anymore, so I did the only thing I could think of. I stopped trying. I stopped visiting Lila. No more secret, whispered exchanges. No more quick knocks on the door just to let her know that I was there, that anyone at all was there for her. Days and weeks and months and years trickled by with Lila never quite leaving my thoughts, but with her existence instead, compartmentalized, confined to the basement of my own mind. At home, it was harder to keep thoughts of her locked away. When my dad brought her dinner hours past my bedtime, I'd lay awake, warm in my bed. Sometimes I'd hear her scream. Sometimes I'd hear the tray clatter to the floor, the plate fracturing on impact. Sometimes I'd hear her crying, awful, painful sobs, while I assembled new Lego sets in the playroom. Sometimes she would call out my name. I'll never forgive myself for this. I hate myself for it, and I deserve to. but I ignored her every time. Worst of all, though, was when she started knocking. I was finishing up my science homework for the day when the first knock came. A quiet knock, but a knock nonetheless. An initiation, an invitation, a confrontation. My blood ran cold as I realized where it was coming from, who it was coming from. I hopped on my bike and didn't come home until dinner was on the table. That night I heard my dad scream back at Lila for the first time, yelled for her to knock it off with all the knocking. He took care of her little brother and her mom, and that he could only do that if she stayed in the basement, if she stayed quiet. She wasn't persuaded, though, and her knocking only grew more frequent and louder. I was about 10 years old by then, so I had a little more freedom, all the freedom in the world, compared to Lila. I avoided my house at all costs, only returning in the evenings, where I'd be greeted immediately by the knocking. By then, it was less knocking and more ramming the total weight of her body into the door. My mother took to vacuuming the house obsessively just to cover up the noise. She wouldn't even look my dad in the eye anymore. I imagined the bruises blooming on Lila's shoulder, up and down the length of her arm. If it hurt her, she didn't let on. She didn't stop. Sleep became a distant memory, leaving me dazed and irritable and confused and, most of all, terrified. I began showing up at my school friends', now my only friend's, house unannounced just to escape Lila's knocking. His parents clearly didn't like me, and tensions rose between the two of us kids, escalating to a boiling point that ended in a fight. I slugged him in the gut, and he returned with the words that broke me, broke everything. A blow far more powerful than he could have delivered with small hands balled up into fists. My mom says you're a bastard, that your mom's a whore. I had to look up the words in my dictionary when I got home. I had to gather the courage to once again ask a difficult question. Mom, am I a bastard? I had to watch my mom lose her momentum, to stop again. I had to watch what little light she had left in her go out. I had to sit there as she left the room, had to sit there spilling hot tears as the knocking kicked up again, each powerful thrust against the door racking my mind, a painful reminder that Lila was coming for me. But my mom came back, and she returned with an old newspaper clipping in her hands, worn at the edges. She held it to her chest as she finally told me the truth about Lila, about Dad's second family in the basement. I was young, but I needed to know. My mom knew it too. Through choking sobs, she told me about my dad's old family, the one he'd had and made before he met her. The horrible mistake they'd made, the one that gave her the best thing she'd ever had in her life, but took away 3 others. About how my dad's old wife was already skating on thin ice, her cries for help that went unanswered. How when she found out about what my mom and my dad were doing, that what little was left beneath her shattered. About how they couldn't have known, but about the guilt she carried regardless. Like a heavy backpack, Mom. Yes, sweetie, but I can never put it down. That Lila was dead, and Isaac too. That their mom had done that to them and then did it to herself too. My dad found them in the basement when he got home from work. That he'd never forgiven himself, and my mom never had either. That when they reappeared back in the basement like nothing had happened, even after their bodies were taken and buried all those years ago, they couldn't think of anything to do but to give them as normal of a life as possible. Yet another difficult question. But why do they have to stay in the basement? I found out later that evening when my dad came home from work and unlocked the door. Lila came out of the shadows, and I flinched instinctively as I saw her face for the first time, saw the gaping hole in her face where her left eye should have been. Isaac was little like Lila said, but the oozing wound to his jaw would have made it nearly impossible for him to speak if he had the chance to grow up. I was scared at first, but I put on my brave face and took Lila by the hand. I played with Lila and Isaac for the first time, shared my toys with them, laughed with them. I didn't meet their mom that day, but I would, years later. Once she and Lila and Isaac knew what became of them, she struggled to cope. She doesn't come out often, but I treat her with kindness when she does. The woman I know her as now couldn't imagine doing what she did. My dad's second family still stayed inside, but they were no longer confined to the shadows of the basement after that day. They became less of my dad's second family, as we all became one larger family that laughed and played and loved together. I don't live in that house anymore. I'm an adult now, with an enormous appreciation for all of the freedom and opportunities available to me that I once took for granted. I know my family is far from normal, even horrible and horrifying in many ways that I helped to perpetuate as a kid, but it's all I've ever known. I love them, all of them. I still visit whenever I can, for birthdays and for Christmas and for summer vacations. And whenever I do visit, I take a moment to be grateful for the fact that when I knock on the front door, Lila opens it. My mother has a special weekly routine, but lately, she's been a little bit off. My mother had always been just a little peculiar. She liked doing things a specific way and always on one specific day. There was a routine she found herself in since I was just a child, and no matter the situation, the weather, or her mood, the routine would never vary. On Mondays, she did the planning. She would spend early noon making a list, always on paper, about all the meals we would have that week. Then she would go through the cupboards and the fridge to see what we still had and added everything we needed to the list, in her perfect cursive handwriting. On Tuesdays, she would go to the fish market just before sunrise, continue to visit the butcher around noon, and finally buy all the other items we needed from the big grocery store just at the outskirts of our suburban neighborhood. On Wednesdays, she cleaned, or rather we cleaned. While Mum liked things a specific way and would usually go over whatever I did after I was finished, she did always accept my help. I suppose it was more for building my character than for an actual need of help. On Thursdays, she did laundry. When the sun was shining, she would hang the clothes on a line out in the garden, and if it didn't, she would use the dryer inside. Either way, Thursdays always smelled like lavender softener. On Fridays, she baked muffins and cake and biscuits. With many spices and herbs, she would make her own creations. Those were the only days that smelled even better than Thursdays. On Saturdays, she would go for a drink. When I was younger, that's when the babysitter would come, but now she could go without having to take care of that. Sometimes she would see her friends and come back in a giggly mood. Sundays were what we called free days. It was the only day that was not assigned to one specific task. We work during the week so that the weekend can be enjoyed. I heard that sentence more often than I could ever count. As I said, my mother had always been a little peculiar, and as I grew older, I realized she was also a little, if not a lot, compulsive. In all my years in life that I lived in that small suburban house with my mother, I never saw her deviate from that schedule. Of course, I wasn't always there to observe, but when I came home from school on Tuesdays, the fridge and cupboards would be fully stocked again, Thursdays would smell like lavender, and Fridays we always had fresh baked goods. Even on holiday, she would find ways to squeeze in whatever needed to be done on the specific days of the week. My mother wasn't always entirely mentally stable, which is something hard to witness as a child, and especially to admit. You want your parents to always do well and tell yourself that they are fine even when they're not. However, in most ways, she luckily seemed to be in control of her compulsions. And most of all, she was always kind and loving, to both of us despite the occasional fight, especially as I grew older and resented her slightly old-fashioned ways. Still, we were a happy family, and in general, things were all right. Until last week, when my mother, for the first time ever since I can remember, seemed to be out of sync. It started on Monday when I woke up and found my mother in the living room watching something strange on TV. The sight of that was weird enough already, because normally she would never turn on the television by herself before evening, and now she was sitting there, wearing her flowery dress and high heels inside, while watching something with complete focus in her eyes. "Mum?" I muttered. Her head slowly turned to the left. She looked up at me and looked at me precisely. No words came out of her mouth. When I looked over at the screen to see what she had been so mesmerized by, I noticed the white noise. There was no channel on. I sat down next to her, tried to find the words to ask what was wrong, but I couldn't. She was acting as if everything was perfectly normal until Dad came down the stairs with his briefcase in hand. "Good afternoon, honey. Are you ready for lunch?" she asked him. My father tilted his head, He could tell that something was wrong, but he didn't mention it either. Instead, he only lifted his briefcase a little and said, "I must go to work." "But of course," my mother smiled. I exchanged a concerned look with my father. He definitely knew that something was up, and I wondered whether they had a fight last night. Was that why Mum was acting strange? Before I could talk to him, however, he had disappeared, and Mum jumped up only 2 seconds later. "I need to go to the dry cleaners. You can make yourself something to eat, yes?" On Tuesday, I didn't expect to see my mother when I got up. At this time, she normally would be at the fish market to get the freshest catch. Instead, I found her by the kitchen table, nervously writing something down. My dad was sitting opposite her, having scrambled eggs and bacon. "Are you making a shopping list?" I asked. It was the wrong day, but at least she was acting a little more normal. Even though she was wearing the exact same dress as the day before. My mother smiled and nodded. "Yes, is there anything you need?" "Eggs and milk. We're out of cornflakes too." She nodded. "Good morning, kiddo," Dad said. They were both sitting together having breakfast, and so I thought that things were back to normal again. He emptied his coffee and got up. "Time for work," he called out. "Oh, honey, could you get some groceries on your way back? Salt, fish, and vinegar, please." Again, my father and I exchanged a look of confusion. Well, the one of mine was the one of confusion, but his look seemed to be of distress. I nodded to silently tell him that I had things in control. Dad nodded back, and then proceeded to head for the door. "Of course, honey," my mother eventually replied. On Wednesday, I found her in the garden, digging up dirt. The exact opposite of what we normally would be doing on that day. She was digging a hole, big and wide, and I simply couldn't say what on earth she might need it for. Dad was gone before I had woken up, so I couldn't talk to him, but I promised myself I would do so tonight. Something was wrong with my mother. At first, I was worried, but I started getting scared, both for her and of her. "Is something wrong?" My father asked that evening. It was difficult to find a moment alone. Mum always seemed to be somehow around. I hated that I had to get away from her to voice my concerns, but I was worried that she wasn't entirely stable. She didn't do anything she normally does. "And did you see that hole outside?" "Dad," I paused for a moment. "I think she might really need help." Dad tilted his head and looked through the window to the garden. I suppose he hadn't seen the hole out there earlier. "I will not go to work tomorrow. Stay here with you. Is that all right?" I sighed in relief. Together we might be able to figure out what was going on, and maybe he could start a conversation with her. "Yes, thanks, Dad. I think that would be really helpful." Thursday, I found Mum in the garden again. Normally that wouldn't be so strange, as I would usually find her there hanging up the sheets. However, this Thursday it was storming outside. It had been raining all morning, and it didn't appear as if it would end anytime soon. "What are you doing? It's pouring cats and dogs," I shouted from the garden door. Dad, who heard me shouting, had appeared behind me and was holding my shoulder. "Not cats and dogs, fish." Mum turned around and laughed, and that is when we saw what she really was doing out there. She was hanging the chopped-off heads of the fish Dad had bought on the clothesline. "Mum?" I could only bring out a whisper. "Something is wrong. We need to help her." Before I could move, Dad was already running outside and guiding my mother back to our living room. Thursday turned into Friday without a moment of sleep, at least for me. I couldn't close my eyes without heads of fish appearing in front of my mind, and the sight of my mother in that same damn dress and that plastered-on smile. Tired and exhausted, I stumbled down the stairs to find my parents both sitting in front of the television. I didn't even bother talking to them and went straight to the kitchen. For the first time in years, there was no sweet smell coming from it. No, instead the stench of vinegar made its way to my nose. We hardly had any food in the house. I suppose Mum had completely forgotten about it, and Dad didn't want to leave her in her current stage. He hardly left her side anymore. Without talking to them, I started with all the chores of the past days, wrote a shopping list. I cleaned and threw some clothes in the washing machine. This might sound as if I only wanted my mother to get back to doing the household, but I swear it had nothing to do with that. I simply was worried because she wasn't herself anymore. The following morning, All the items that I wrote on the list were sitting in paper bags on the kitchen counter. I assumed that Dad had gotten out to buy them. On Saturday, she did the most terrifying thing so far, a sight I will not be able to delete from my mind anytime soon. It started only in the evening. The entire day, both my parents were acting normal. Mom even cooked, and we sat around the table, talking and laughing. She did most of the talking, and I could have sworn she was entirely herself again. Or she had learned to adapt, at least in some ways. When night came, however, everything turned entirely messed up. I woke up from the sound of a loud clatter and immediately jumped out of bed. I had been a nervous wreck lately, and it didn't take much to startle me. The sound was coming from downstairs, and my initial thought was that someone had broken in, but then I heard my mother humming something from downstairs. "Mum?" I called out. "Go to bed, child," she shouted back, but I was already making my way to the stairs. She had painted the walls with strange anagrams using red paint. Still wearing the same dress, she looked up and smiled, but this time it appeared far less sincere. I believe I even saw a twitch in her eye. Dad was sitting on a chair next to her. "Mum, we need to get you help. I will call the hospital, okay?" No, I will help," Dad said and took the paint can from her hand. A tear rolled down her cheek, but the smile never disappeared. "Why, thank you, honey." "Families help each other," Dad smiled back. "Yes, well, I should go and buy more paint. The child will help me," Mum said. Dad glanced at me. "What the fuck? It's the middle of the night. Look, Mum, I'm really sorry, but..." She held my mouth shut with her hand before I could say another word. "We have to buy paint. Any normal mother and her child do just that. It is of utter importance for a decent home." Dad looked around at the red paint on the wall and on my mother's face, and finally said the last thing I expected. "That sounds perfectly reasonable. See you soon, honey." I had no idea what to do. It seemed that both my parents had lost their minds, but I couldn't possibly let my mother leave on her own, or let her drive a car in that state. So I went outside with her, and sat behind the steering wheel with the intention to drive her to a hospital. However, as soon as I started driving, I couldn't for the life of me remember what direction I had to go. "Just keep going straight. Follow the street," my mother finally said. Her smile had disappeared, and her leg was shaking. "Just keep going, honey." I had no idea what to say, and so I kept going straight until we had left the neighborhood and the surrounding area as well. We found ourselves on the freeway when I couldn't hold it in anymore. I found the nearest exit and stopped. My mother was trembling, and in the dark light, with the splatters of red paint on her face, I finally realized that I might have made a huge mistake. "Mum?" I hardly brought out the word. She opened her mouth, but no words came out at first. She swallowed and then finally spoke. "I am so sorry, my love. I didn't want to believe it. It made no sense." "What are you talking about?" She looked at me as if I was the one losing my mind. "That thing in there, that was not your father. Didn't you notice?" At first, I thought I would only act slightly different to see if he would notice that something was off, but it only copied whatever we were doing or saying. She took a deep breath. "I woke up a few times at night. It never sleeps. It sits in the bed with its eyes open, waiting for us to wake up. I am so sorry. I just couldn't believe it at first. I thought maybe something was wrong with your father. We should have left or called for help. But..." She stayed silent for a moment. My memories were blurry, and I had to make sure that it was him and not me. My palms wouldn't stop sweating, and my head started racing like crazy. This whole week I had been so focused on my mother, I didn't notice that Dad only agreed to the things I was saying. He didn't do anything, and suddenly it felt as if something shattered in my mind. My mother had always been a little peculiar, especially after my father passed away. "Mum, that wasn't our home, was it?" I gulped. "How did we end up there?" She looked at me, a reflection of my own fear and confusion. "I have absolutely no idea. It must have somehow lured us in there and made us forget."